Welcome, everybody, to the Inner Carnivore Podcast, Season 2, Episode 6. My guest today is someone I have been looking forward to for a very long time. He is an American MD, currently a neurosurgical registrar in Australia, former All-American and professional rugby player in America and England. He is the host of the Plant-Free MD podcast, someone that I truly enjoy, Dr. Anthony Chaffee. If you guys would like to support the show, it takes 10 seconds, completely free. Like it, leave a review, rate the show, leave a comment, send it to your friends. It helps immensely. I think you guys are going to love this episode. Enjoy the show. Welcome, everybody, to the show. Dr. Anthony Chaffee, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Now, I know you're a UW guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hopefully you have not been watching this season because football's bad this year.
Jeez. I mean, we went to the national championships, and then what happens, Oh, no, I haven't been watching, but my brother-in-law is a professor of computer science at UW, and he's a big Husky football fan. And so, that's going to be some commiseration at Christmas, I'm sure.
So that's like one of the first things we connected on is we're both from Washington, which is weird now that I'm in Arizona, you're in Australia, and we find out that we basically grew up a few hours away from each other. So that's where I want to jump into it. So you go to University of Washington. If I remember right, you studied microbiology, cell biology.
Yeah, molecular and cellular biology.
Molecular
and chemistry.
So you come out of, you would think, now I have a little bit of experience. I've taken microbiology, I've taken anatomy and physiology, biology, all of those. You would think coming out of this, you would have a well-rounded idea of nutrition, right? Graduating, and before you go on and do all your medical school stuff, what was your view on nutrition being that young and just going through all of these college courses and coming out with your degree?
Well, it was interesting. Now, first of all, I should clarify. It's actually interesting. You're down in Arizona now. I actually ended up finishing up at University of Arizona. So I had my best friend was down there, and so I went down there. We were playing rugby together, and so I actually transferred my credits down from UW down to Arizona, and so I finished up my last year there. But interestingly, when I was at UW, it wasn't the nutrition class. I took nutrition, I took biochemistry, I took organic chemistry and biology and botany and all these other sorts of classes. And so I had these sort of building blocks and pieces there that I then later used and built upon. And everything just sort of made sense when I started looking at it from the right lens. But I had a very, very traditional way of eating. You take a nutrition class and it really just codifies what everybody just thinks is the right way to eat. Or you need majority of your calories from carb, try to only a little bit from fat, and you need to get X amount of protein as a percentage of your calories, X, Y, and Z. And so you're taking classes on nutrition, and they're basically telling you what you already know. It's just now you're getting tested on specific numbers to do with that, but it's the same idea. And then I took a class in cancer biology, which was very interesting because it sort of put some of these things together from botany, where I learned very early on that plants and animals are an evolutionary arms race, that plants became more and more poisonous and toxic, so less and less animals could eat them so they could survive and thrive. And then animals becoming more and more adapted to specific poisons in specific plants so they could eat that specific plant and survive and thrive. Like a wallaby here in Australia, they eat things that are just considered extremely deadly to anything else. But that's their evolutionary niche. And so that's how they survive. They don't have to compete for resources, and they do well. And so you learn all that and you understand all that. And then you get home, you go home and you get told to eat your vegetables, right? Or you go to a nutrition class and you get told to eat your frickin' vegetables, right? And so, and comparing that to McDonald's fries and the shake, vegetables are better. Like, gee, I wonder why. Okay. And so when I took that cancer biology class, that was the first time someone started talking about the harmful toxins and effects, and specifically carcinogens that were in the fruits and vegetables that we eat. And so my professor of cancer biology told us about all the different carcinogens, like in Brussels sprouts. He told us, this is like 2000, 2001. And he said that at that time, they had already discovered 136 known carcinogens just in Brussels sprouts, and over 100 in mushrooms, and 60, 80, over 100 in all these other fruits and vegetables that you eat, any sort of produce product that you eat. And he literally gave us a handout. I really wish I had kept this thing, but it was a list of all the different produce items, fruits and vegetables, grains, etc., beans, legumes that you would eat. And there was a number next to it, and that was the number of identified carcinogens in each one of these things. It was multiple pages. And it was every single plant that you have ever eaten that was on this, and it had dozens. And I looked through, and there wasn't a single one that had less than 60 known carcinogens. So we were very blown away by that and very taken aback. And I remember we were all wildly looking around, looking for like a TA, like laughing in the corner. He's just joking. But there wasn't. There was no one. Everyone was just as shocked as I was. There was nobody who was, in on the joke, because it wasn't a joke. He was very serious. And so we eventually realized that and settled down. And he sort of looked at us, and we were all sort of quiet. I remember thinking in my head, vegetables are still good for you though, right? And he just gave us a funny look, and he just said, I don't eat salad. I don't eat vegetables. I don't let my kids eat vegetables. Plants are trying to kill you. And I was like, right, screw plants. And I just stopped. And so my view on nutrition at that point was just predicated on that. I would not eat plants. And that's where it came from. I understood that plants had toxins. And he had sort of hammered that home very clearly, that these things don't want to be eaten. And I just stopped. I went to the store and just looking around. I didn't know what to eat because everything had plants in it, or some sort of plant ingredient, or just were exclusively plants. And so I just ended up picking up some eggs and meat, and I said, okay, eggs and meat, that's what I'm going to eat. And so that was my sort of, but it wasn't like an overarching view on nutrition. It wasn't like I had put those two things together, because probably in second grade, I was told that humans have been apex predators for over 2 million years. Apex predators by definition are carnivores. Is just what humans eat and have eaten for as long as humans have been humans and before. And so we know that there's very, very clear evidence that humans have been alive and thriving in the Arctic Circle during the ice ages. And so when you have a mile-high block of ice and there's nothing growing up there, what do you eat? You eat animals that are around. So you have a lot of marine life that are living in those conditions, no problem. And then you have different sorts of sort of amphibious animals like seals that will go in and out of the water, birds, etc., and the things that prey on those sorts of things as well. So there's actually quite a robust ecology and food system there. It just is not derived from a lot of terrestrial plants. You get like planktons and algae and things like that, and then the food chain lifts up from there in the ocean. But there were no plants, and so I hadn't put that together. I just wasn't going to eat plants, and I did that. I was probably about, I think I was 20 or 21 years old at that point. I think 21, and I did that for another 5 years until I was in England and playing rugby over there. And I just sort of slipped off because some of the meat had little crumbs on it. And I just sort of convinced myself, the same argument that people are saying now, like, well, dose makes the poison. It's probably not that bad. And so I convinced myself of that. And I said, okay, well, it's just a bit of crumbs. It's not that big of a deal. I'm only doing it a few days a week. Everything else is fine. But it wasn't fine. Dose makes poison sometimes, but the dose can be really small. And that's what it is in these sorts of things. Actually, there's research showing that doses does not always make the poison, because in the case of glyphosate, it's been shown that glyphosate actually has an inverse response with endocrine disruption. So the lower the exposure of glyphosate, the worse the endocrine disruption. Right. And then you get more glyphosate exposure and has other sort of toxic and deleterious effects. But it starts off big. And actually, the higher the dose actually has a weaker endocrine disruption, which is very strange. It's very interesting. Most people would say that can't happen. But that's what people like MIT professor Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who's been studying glyphosate for well over a decade. That's what they're saying. So that was my view on nutrition for a long time. And then I sort of slipped off of that and sort of went back to eating a more normal diet for me. But for me, my normal diet was a very clean, omnivorous diet. I never ate processed food. I cooked every single meal. My mom always cooked every meal at our house, and I learned to cook from her, not nearly as well as she did, but I picked up some tricks. And so I always cooked. I always made my own meals. They were always heavily meat-based. I typically avoided avoided the fat, but not always, just naturally wanted to eat more meat. And I ate a salad because you're supposed to eat stupid salads. And that was pretty much it. I never had a junk food diet. I never ate the standard American diet. So the accusation that the only difference that this makes is because you're going from a standard processed food diet into a carnivorous diet is nonsense. There are many people that come from a clean, whole foods, vegan or ketogenic diet and have massive improvements once they cut out vegetables and start eating more meat, like in the case of the vegetarians. So that was my view on nutrition. Really came from my parents, and it was just a clean omnivorous diet that you eat yourself, but you should have some protein and some carbs and some veggies and things like that. That was just sort of what it was. And I gravitated more towards the meat side of things because that was my preference. And then for that 5-year period of bliss and harmony, I was only eating meat and feeling better than I ever had in my life. And then about 7 years ago was when I sort of put those two together, that biologically humans actually are carnivores, and that matters. And that's what I was doing for those 5 years in my early 20s when I never felt better in my life. And I was always trying to figure out, how do I get back to that? How do I get back to feeling like that, performing like that, physically and academically? And once I figured that out and I started putting that in place, I had all the same effects. And so I felt like I was 22 again at 38. And I started going back and playing rugby at a high level and felt great doing it. And that's when I said, okay, there's something here. And I started. I had some time off, and so I just got back from doing humanitarian work in Bangladesh, and so I had time, and I was spending 8 to 10 hours a day reading studies and looking things up and trying to figure out what we knew and what we could prove, and I ended up here.
So that's super interesting, because I came from a clean diet too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the number one thing. Oh, you probably had a junk diet before. I'm like, yeah, I did, like for a period of time, but in my 20s, I was super clean, and then I kind of got dad bod and kind of slipped into it a little, and most of it was snacking, right? Like it's still like clean meals. And then I went like Whole30. So just like no processed foods. I did it for 90 days, no cheats, no nothing. And I still didn't feel great. Like I lost weight, but I didn't feel great. And then when I went carnivore, like it changed everything. I was like, man, I feel so much better. So I'm right there with you. But what I think is the biggest problem is so many people that I talk to, so many videos that I see, is people take studies and then they try to make the study fit their life, right? And so they're like, well, this study says I need to eat more fiber, and this study says I need to eat more fruits and vegetables. And this says I need to eat lower fat. So I'm going to do what the study tells me to do, and I'm just going to kind of make it work. When in reality, like I had a similar approach to you where, I had the same idea, like you got to eat your vegetables. I tried to force myself to eat vegetables. But after realizing that it didn't work like that, then I went and like tried to find studies to tell me why. Like, why is this happening? And what's the explanation for it? Because obviously it's happening. Like lots of people are happening. And, that's when I kind of came across all of this, and I was like, man, this is actually wild that there is like physiology that supports what's happening, and I'm experiencing it, and a whole bunch of other people are experiencing. And I think more people should try it.
Yeah. I came to it from a similar perspective. I was very surprised because, when I was doing this without realizing it, there was nothing called a carnivore diet back then. And there was Atkins, but that was sort of it. I didn't ever really thought of it in the same way. I just didn't eat vegetables. I just wasn't going to eat anything from plants. And when I started looking into this, I just started asking questions, and I said, okay, well, if this is true, we should be able to find evidence with which to test this against. And so I started looking for disparities between vegans and non-vegans and things like that, different sorts of diseases, autism, for example, fertility rates, all these other sorts of things. And there are quite a lot of these things. Now you can get a study that says anything. So you have to look at the quality of the study. You have to look at the methodology. You don't just look at the conclusions that the author drew. You have to look at the study itself and say, okay, come up with your own conclusion, and don't just take their word for it, because a lot of times they do that wrong. Some of the critiques that some people had when I talked about Professor Bruce Ames, his work at UC Berkeley, where he showed that 99.99% of toxic elements are naturally occurring in the plant. So he said that 99.99% of pesticides and insecticides were naturally occurring in the plant. And so they were 10,000 times more abundant by weight than the pesticides we knew. And those are just the toxins that we knew about at the time in the late 80s and early 90s, where, he only found he was looking at, I think, 42 different toxins, 20 of which were shown to be carcinogenic in the lab. And then 10 years later, when I'm taking cancer biology, we know about 136 just in Brussels sprouts. So obviously we found more since then. And so that number is probably a lot higher than 10,000 and 99.99%. But just using those figures, he found that mushrooms were hundreds of times more carcinogenic to lab animals and experiments and bench studies than the pesticides that they were looking at the time. This was before glyphosate, so they were looking at something called ALAR. And they were talking about banning ALAR because they said, oh, look, this stuff is a poison. And it literally is. They're spraying this on plants you spray pesticides on plants to kill the animals and insects trying to consume those plants. And so, of course, it's a toxin. It's designed to be a toxin. That's the whole idea. And he showed that there's 10,000 times more naturally occurring in the plant. And his conclusion was, since we know that fruits and vegetables are so good for you, obviously pesticides can't be all that bad. And so why are we banning these things? Fair enough. If you're going to eat the plant and that's worse than the pesticide, fine. Maybe don't get too bent out of shape about that particular pesticide. But that's not what the data showed. The data showed objectively there was 10,000 times more toxins, insecticides, and pesticides in the plant than the pesticide. And that the plants, like mushrooms, were hundreds of times more likely to cause cancer in animal studies. So that's what the objective reality is. He drew a conclusion that led him off somewhere to say, yeah, pesticides are fine. Okay, well, that's his take from that, but that's not what the evidence showed. The evidence wasn't about, are plants safe? That didn't study that. It studied how many toxins are in there and how bad are they compared to pesticides. That's what that showed. So you can't draw a conclusion based on anything else about how healthy or relatively healthy plants are for you. You can only look at them in the context of pesticides, and that's what it did. And it showed they were way, way, way worse than a known toxin that is designed to kill life. That's the purpose of a pesticide. You have to know how to sort of look at these things and actually draw your own conclusions, and don't just read the headline or read the conclusion yourself. But I tried looking at a lot of different things. There is quite a lot of evidence. There's robust evidence. I mean, you look at ketogenic diets, for instance. There are thousands of studies on ketogenic diets, randomized controlled trials with large numbers of patients and subjects and humans, et cetera, and animals, but in humans. And they show massive benefits to specific medical issues with specific endpoints. And it's the most robustly studied diet that there is. There really haven't been any studies or diets that have been studied with the rigor that ketogenic diets have been. What is a ketogenic diet? You're just excluding carbohydrates. So people miss the telltale, what do you replace carbohydrates with when you take them away? You replace it with fat and protein. Primarily, you replace that with animal meat as a result of that. So you could potentially do that with a more plant-based approach, but it's much more difficult. And especially for the purposes of studies, it's very difficult. And so they don't tend to do that. They tend to be meat-based. So the majority of these studies are looking at high-fat, meat-based ketogenic diets. So you're looking at meat, and you're eating a heavily meat-based diet that is ketogenic, and people are having massive health benefits as a result of that. Okay, well, a carnivore diet is a heavily meat-based ketogenic diet. It just excludes some other things as well. So we have very good evidence that eating a lot of meat is not harmful. We know that from a lot of different resources, but also randomized controlled trials showing that if you feed people a lot of meat in a ketogenic context, diabetes goes away and all these other sorts of health markers improve, obesity, etc., cardiovascular health, biochemical markers, etc. And so, I just went through and I just tried to find what the evidence was. I wasn't trying to find what the evidence was to support the carnivore diet. I just was like, okay, that's something interesting. There should be evidence to support this. What do we know? What can we prove? What can we find out? And I just started asking questions, and I started seeing how to test this theory against the literature. And everything that I kept finding was more and more in support of a heavily meat-based, if not exclusively meat-based diet. And so then I sort of had that moment. I'm like, okay, well, I don't want to be the victim of confirmation bias and only looking for things that support my view. so I started saying, okay, well, there are a whole bunch of people that are like vegans and vegetarians, doctors and researchers, etc., who were saying that eating meat is a really bad idea and the cause of all disease. Okay, so what are they seeing that I'm not? What do they know that I don't? And so I started looking at their websites, at their lectures. I started engaging with them on their platforms, and the arguments that they had, I knew to be false. The whole idea that, the main one hangs around cholesterol. That cholesterol and saturated fat just cause heart disease and all these other sorts of problems. They don't. There's nothing but evidence to show that they don't. And get into that if you like. But, the highest levels of evidence that have the best quality randomized controlled trials with thousands of patients have only ever shown that cholesterol does not cause heart disease. And in fact, reducing cholesterol and reducing animal fats, not just saturated, but animal fats, and replacing it with polyunsaturated seed oils and margarines, that either does no benefit by reducing animal fats and cholesterol as far as cardiovascular disease, or they've also shown in the larger, more well-designed studies and better controlled studies, shown that when you do that, when you lower animal fat and you lower cholesterol, more people die of heart attacks and strokes. That's what the experimental data shows. And then saturated fat, that has been roundly shown to be a complete non-issue when it comes to cardiovascular disease. So much so that the 2005 dietary guidelines actually removed the restriction or the recommended restrictions on dietary saturated fat and cholesterol, because they said it has absolutely no bearing on serum cholesterol or cardiovascular disease. And it takes a good 10 to 15 years of strong evidence to change the guidelines. The guidelines move much slower than the published literature, which is 2 to 3 years behind the cutting edge. So for them to say that in 2015, that tells you that this is something that has been boiling around for a long time. There's been a lot of evidence bubbling up to the surface for 10, 15 years before that. 2020 is a large umbrella review looking at all the best meta-analyses and randomized controlled trials to do with saturated fat consumption and cardiovascular disease, published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, the top cardiology journal in the world. And they found that there's absolutely no connection whatsoever between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. In fact, they found an inverse relationship between saturated fat consumption and stroke. So people that ate more saturated fat had less strokes, and less saturated fat had more strokes. And so they as well said there should be no arbitrary upper limit on saturated fat. We can't find any unsafe upper limit. And the authors of this study, some of them had actually been on the boards of different dietary panels recommending lower saturated fat content. So, it's interesting, how these things change. And so, I was aware of these data. It wasn't 2020 at the time, but there was all the studies leading up to that. So I knew about all those, and I knew about the, cholesterol was a bit of a farce, and that, is more likely, from junk foods and fructose and things like that. And then there were just things that they were just flat out made up, trying to say that like humans were herbivores. I'm like, how do no one's ever argued that. I've seen recently, since I did the Plants Are Trying to Kill You talk, which obviously came from that professor, the title of that talk, that at first people were saying, oh, that's ridiculous, or plants are good for you. There's no toxins in there. And then they like read a book and they're like, oh shit, actually there are. That's actually a lot of toxins in there. That's how plants defend themselves. But then they try to say, well, it's actually, yes, there's toxins, but they're hormetic. They're good toxins. They're the type of toxins you want. It's like a story my dad told me. They had some friends in South Africa, and there was like, they were talking about like a, lion attack or something like that somewhere. And this lady from South Africa said, no, that not our lions. Our lions are good. Our lions wouldn't do that. It's like they're lions. And so, it's the same thing. No. Yes, there are toxins, but no, they're good toxins. They do good. They're good for you. And then more recently, I saw some of these vegan doctors like Dr. Neil Barnard, been a vegan proponent for years. He actually used one of my clips from that talk and talking about plant toxins. Oh, well, yes, there are plant toxins. Yes, they do make toxins to defend themselves. But remember that these are the plants that we evolved with, and so we're well used to them. And that would be a good argument. That would be the only way that any plant would be okay with us if we co-evolved with them. and develop that innate ability to degrade these toxins. But we didn't. We did not evolve with these things. In fact, the plants that we eat now simply didn't exist when we were evolving. The plants that we have now have all been manipulated by some sort of breeding program, or more recently, genetic hybridization and even bioengineering. So the plants that we're eating now and the plants that we've been eating for thousands of years are not the plants that even existed when we were evolving. And a lot of these plants were from all different continents. We did not evolve independently on different continents. We couldn't transport these plants with us. We couldn't bring these plants with us until very recently. And again, we know that humans were alive and thriving in the Arctic Circle during the ice ages. Okay, so there are no plants there. So we're not eating the plants that were even existed 50,000 years ago, let alone 300,000 years ago, let alone 1,000,000 years ago. And we know that we weren't eating these things, at least in those conditions at those times, when there wasn't anything growing in any case. So the evidence that they had just had a lot of holes. So when I looked into their arguments and I looked into the data, it was faulty. And so, the goalposts change all the time. When you show these ideologues, the clear deficits in their arguments and evidence, that they never just go, oh gosh, you're right. Shoot, I guess I got it wrong. And then try something else. They just pivot to something else, like first was, there's no such thing as plant toxins. And then it was like, all right, well, they're hormetic toxins. They're good toxins. And then, okay, well, they're the toxins that we grew up with. And so we're evolved to adapt to, it's always moving. It's always shifting around. And now when you talk to normal people that have been sort of taken in by that vegan ideology, it makes sense to them. And so when you're showing them that evidence, you're showing them, hey, those arguments that sounded so good to you, here's the counter arguments. Those people often do see the light, and then they try eating more meat and they instantly feel better. And, but, either way, there's a lot of competing evidence. There's a lot of conflicting studies, and specifically there's a lot of conflicting opinions based on those studies and evidence. And so what the hell do you do? Well, all it comes down to is all the evidence, however you want to look at it, all it can do is help influence the decisions that you make in your life as a doctor, and help influence how you practice medicine and what you recommend to your patients. But as a patient, it comes down to, okay, what do I think is the best thing for my health and my life? And then you try it. It's not going to kill you. Obviously, we've been eating meat for millions of years. There's nothing harmful in it. We have millions of people around the world coming to this freshly without any health issues. We have direct population studies with the Maasai, which are carnivore and with a lot of dairy. And we have the Akikuyu, which are largely plant-based vegetarians, looking back in the 90s and early 30s when they were all living out in their natural, wonderful environment. And, there's no pesticides or chemicals or anything like that. The Maasai were massively healthier, larger, taller, better developed, better teeth, larger brains. And they interbred and intermarried with the Akikuyu for time, since time immemorial. So they were genetically similar populations. And yet there's a 5-inch disparity in the adult male height of the Maasai and the Akikuyu. So, you can look at all these things. That meat is safe. We know that plants have toxins. We can look at all the other points of evidence as well. But at some point, you just have to say, what am I going to do with my life? Am I going to eat vegetables? Am I going to eat meat? Am I going to eat a mix of the two? Am I just going to eat crap because I just don't care anymore? That's a decision that you have to make. And so you can look at these studies, you can listen to these opinions and advice, but at some point you have to say, what am I going to do with my life? So that's what a lot of people are doing. By the millions now, they're just saying, okay, look, that makes sense. I'm just going to try it. And so by the millions, people are doing things like you, or things like, that sounds crazy, but I don't know, maybe I'll give it a try. And you see massive benefits to their health. I've seen simple changes, deliberate changes in the diet, like going to a ketogenic carnivore-based diet, have better outcomes for very serious life-threatening conditions than everything I was ever taught in medical school and beyond. This reverses diabetes. We have clinical evidence of that in humans, and I see it on a daily basis in my practice. This reverses, or at least massively improves, every autoimmune issue I've ever seen in my entire life. All of my patients who are able to do this are able to come off their medications to a large extent. Sometimes, like if you have Hashimoto's, say, you can damage the thyroid to such an extent that it's not able to recover fully, and you may need to still be on some amount of thyroid medication, or you've already burned out your thyroid and had it removed. So obviously you need to keep taking medication, but it can address the underlying root cause of that initial damage, and your body can heal what it can heal from. Type 1 diabetic, same thing. You get someone who's a 16-year type 1 diabetic and may stop that underlying disease process that caused it in the first place and stop other things from rearing up, but is it going to allow your body to produce beta islet cells? Well, I haven't seen that yet. There are animal studies showing that you can with ketogenic diets, called a fasting mimicking diet, because ketogenic diets are a 4-letter word in some academic circles, so they hide it by calling it a fasting mimicking diet. It's a ketogenic diet. And we've seen that in animals. We haven't seen that in humans yet, but I have seen that when you catch a type 1 diabetic early on. I have one patient that I just saw a few weeks ago. She went into the hospital with diabetic ketoacidosis a couple months ago, and she was put on all this insulin, and her blood sugars and everything were just all over the place and crazy. And she's trying to sort of track this and how much she is eating, and she's getting hypos and all these other sorts of things, and it swings ups and downs. Her husband was a patient of mine. He was aware of, the carnivore diet, and he brought her in to get, full blood panel, see if there's anything else going on that could be, contributing to this, and to talk to her about nutrition. Was able to get her onto a ketogenic carnivore, close to, she still had some things here and there, but 98% of what she ate was ketogenic carnivore. And her blood sugars just stabilized immediately. And then all of a sudden, she'd have this link to her app. It was on his app too. So he'd be at work and I always get this alert that her glucose had just shot up. And he's like, texting, like, what are you eating? What do you do? I was like, I just had an almond. I was like, stop it. And so, they were able to really control her blood sugar at that point. And then she started eating less and less insulin. And that was interesting. And so we did something called C-peptide blood test. Because when you make insulin in your body, it's bound to another molecule and it breaks off, and that's C-peptide. So you have insulin and C-peptide in your bloodstream. When you get exogenous injectable insulin, it doesn't come with C-peptide. So you can check someone's insulin, and you also check the C-peptide, and you can say, is this insulin coming from the person? And she had C-peptide. She actually started producing insulin again. It was very low, but it was there. And then a month later, it had gone up another 50%. And she was off all of her exogenous insulin, and her insulin levels were normal. So that was all of her endogenous production. And you look back at the history, and you look back at the medical literature, ketogenic diets, meat-based, high-fat, ketogenic diets were the only treatment for diabetes since the 1700s up until 1921 when we discovered insulin, and then everything became about insulin. But for 140 years, the only thing that would keep diabetics alive was a high-fat, meat-based ketogenic diet. That's what the evidence shows. That's what the real-world evidence shows. And people were not getting heart attacks. They were not dying of strokes in a massive scale. And so I see this massively improving patients. We talk about cardiovascular health. I have patients who have been on Doppler ultrasound of their carotids, reversing their plaques. That's anecdotal, but it's interesting. Congestive heart failure, that's a massive killer. It's a horrible disease. You feel wretched. And when your heart, cardiac output becomes so poor that you can't really survive, you have to get onto the heart transplant list, and it's on all these medications, etc. I have patients that had ejection fractions around 12 to 14 on medications. So that's the best their body could do with modern medicine. And traditionally, we would say that will never get better. That's only going to get worse. We don't know why. Okay. They changed their diet to a ketogenic carnivore diet. 3 months later, they have normal ejection fraction. I haven't seen anything but that. Now, I've only seen, a handful of these cases, both in my own practice and then people I've spoken to outside of my practice. But I'm going to be meeting with a cardiologist here in Perth on the weekend who's a carnivore and recommends carnivore diets to his cardiology patients, and see about getting a study going, an interventional trial, saying, hey, why don't we get people on the standard of care with coronary heart, congestive heart failure, and see, and have a controlled experiment, and don't just look retrospectively. Let's look at this from an experimental point of view and see. So, I mean, I just, when I see people on healthy, so-called clean omnivorous diets, clean ketogenic diets that already have meat and just clean veggies, etc., and vegetarians, vegans, who have changed to just eating meat and massively improved their health. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing people give it a try and be benefited. I have seen hundreds of thousands of people go from a plant-based diet to a strict carnivore diet and massively improve their health. I have yet to hear of anybody who has gone from a carnivore diet to a vegan diet and improved their health. There's certainly people that decide to go back to eating a more omnivorous diet, but I have never heard someone go like, oh my God, I'm never eating meat again. I've never heard that. Maybe they exist, but I would want to know some specifics about it. But we're seeing this in droves in the other direction. The vast majority of people who subscribe to my channels are former vegans, plant-based, vegetarians, things like that. And they've just totally changed their health. And some of these people had destroyed their health being plant-based, and some people die doing plant-based. This shows up in the news. You could read newspaper articles about this, about how vegan mothers breastfeeding their child, the kid is dying from the breast milk. Okay, that's horrible, and people are being arrested because of this. They're saying, hey, you're neglecting your child. You're not providing what they need, and they died because of it, and that's your responsibility. So no one's ever done that from a carnivore diet. That's never happened, but there's always these mental gymnastics about, why plants are so great and meat is so bad, contrary to all of the available evidence. I mean, the only evidence that matters is what happens to you in your own life. If you do something and you have a different outcome than what a study says, obviously the study doesn't apply to you. The studies aren't perfect, and you're never going to make them perfect. You can only use them to guide your behavior. And so at a certain point, you need to have that trial and error, and you just give it a try, see how it goes. And if you feel better doing it, great. If you want to go back to eating it another way, do it. It's your choice. The whole reason that people like you and I are talking about this is because we think we're onto something, and this is something that we've seen improve our lives and the lives of the people around us and our patients or clients. And it's something that we're trying to share with other people. At the end of the day, people are adults. They get to make their own decision. People want to smoke. I don't care. That's their call. As long as they don't think they're smoking for health reasons, that bothers me. People used to be told that smoking, was fine. It was good for you. And 9 out of 10 doctors smoke Camel. That was an actual ad, right? And, Guinness, you see these old advertisements for Guinness, back in the 20th century, like, in the 40s or 50s or whatever. And they're like, Guinness for strength, Guinness for health, like pregnant women in Ireland were prescribed Guinness to get their iron levels up, right? Maybe meat. Have you heard of it? Why are you boozing? So people were prescribed, a Guinness a day or 3 Guinness a day while they were pregnant, right? And when I was in Ireland, I spoke to the older generation. They were telling me that. They were telling me they were recommended to drink Guinness as a pregnant young woman. So people should do whatever they want to do, but you try these things out and see what works best for you. And when people are doing that, they're finding massive improvements by eating more meat and less plants.
Yeah, and I think one of the huge things, so I first heard plant defense chemicals, right? I heard it from Saladino, I think was the first one that I've heard from. And it sounds like a conspiracy theory, right? Like you're like, plant defense chemicals. I still like cringe at the word a little bit.
Mm.
But then I Googled it, right? And I found studies and I found like peer-reviewed publications. And they're like, yeah, plants have plant defense chemicals. I was like, wait, what? And then they're like, yeah, like it stresses the body, but it stresses the body kind of like working out does, like you stress it and then you come back better. So it's totally fine. I was like, okay, that's a little weird. And then I started going down the rabbit hole of studies and realized just how overblown risk estimates are, like how they use statistics. And it's funny you brought up smoking, because I actually just did a video on a smoking study that came out of Australia. And they're like, you hear like smoking's going to kill you, right? You're going to get lung cancer. You are 3,000% more likely to get lung cancer smoking than you are not smoking. They're like, oh, like smoking's going to kill me. And yet that study out of Australia showed that 26% of people that smoked 35 cigarettes a day, got lung cancer by the time they're 80. Now, there's other considerations that go into smoking, CPD, heart disease, all this other stuff. But lung cancer, you still have a 75% chance of not getting lung cancer smoking 35 cigarettes a day. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so then you look at like these risks of the red meat, and so many people are convinced that you are going to die. Like, I know you get it, right? Like, I get it all the time. You're going to get heart disease. You're going to get colon cancer. You are going to die from eating too much red meat. How, like, that's a real fear for people. Like, they just cannot get over this mental block. How do you help people realize that even if all of these studies were true, even if all of their estimates were correct, your risk still only goes up absolute just a little bit? How do you help reconcile people that when they've been convinced that eating too much red meat is going to kill them?
Well, the thing is too, is that there are three kinds of lies. There are lies, there are damn lies, and there are statistics.
That's
so
the
these
exact
are lies of
quote I put in my
Right. Yeah. I think it was originally Benjamin Disraeli that said that, and but Mark Twain popularized it. That's who I heard it from. But he gives credit to Benjamin Disraeli, who was a prime minister in England way long time ago. So this is part of human nature. People just manipulate statistics and facts in order to push an agenda. In fact, you were reading the ancient Greek histories and Thucydides. There's a civil war, and he was just going crazy. He was just like, they're changing the definitions of words to push a political agenda. Like, what the hell is going on here? We do that now. Like, oh, that, you say a word and it's just like, oh, you can't say that. Well, why can't I say that? Well, because it means this. Well, like, no, but I didn't mean it like that. It means this as well. No, it doesn't mean that anymore. Like, I'm sorry, what? Like, are you the Oxford English Dictionary? Like, no, I'm sorry. Like, that's a word and it means this. And so, there's a lot of crazy things that people do. When I just try to reassure people, we've been eating meat since time immemorial, and you look at the studies that say, well, there's an increased risk of, say, cancer with red meat, colon cancer, or something like that. And that's the opinion of a certain group. It's actually not the opinion of most of that group or much of that group in the WHO, but that's what the WHO decided, that processed meat was a known carcinogen and that red meat was a possible carcinogen or a likely carcinogen. And what do they base that on? They base that on about 30 studies that showed a very weak correlation, 18% increased relative association, because none of these studies were causative. None of them could show a cause and effect relationship. So it increased by 18%. But the problem is that in epidemiology, if it doesn't increase by at least 200%, it's background noise, because correlation is not causation. In order to look at any correlation, it needs to be strong enough of a correlation. We have all of these confounding factors to say, okay, well, this could be something significant. There could be a cause and effect relationship there. There is a very strong relationship and correlation between ice cream sales and shark attacks, right? And is that because sharks enjoy eating tasty ice cream filled children? Ice cream fattened children? Maybe. Or it could be that when it's hot in the summer and people buy ice cream, they also go in the water where the sharks are. Right? One has nothing to do with the other except for this confounding factor that influences both, which would be heat. So the same thing can be true of anything else. And that's why you have to look at these in that context. So in statistics, you would not even consider something like that significant, but they did, because that pushed their agenda. And in order to push that, and now a lot of these studies had other confounding factors. These populations were more likely to smoke. They were more likely to drink. They were more likely to eat junk food. They're more likely to do other sort of dangerous behaviors that put you at an increased risk of various, poor health outcomes. And they didn't account for those sorts of things in those studies. And that's probably why they chose those studies, because they excluded hundreds of better quality studies of higher levels of evidence that showed absolutely no connection between red meat and cancer or colon cancer or any other cancer or any other deleterious health effect. In fact, the University of Washington looked at over 800 of these studies. WHO only looked at 30 so, and the UW University of Washington looked at over 800, and they found very, very weak evidence to say that there was a connection between red meat and cancer, and that most of these things showed absolutely no connection, and they showed no connection between red meat and cardiovascular disease or any other sort of poor health outcome. So it you just reassure people that, a lot of these things are manipulated opinions from people with an agenda. There was a guy who was on that WHO panel who subsequently came out and said that was the most difficult thing he's ever had to go through in his professional career, because he had to sit there and watch them throw out hundreds of good quality studies that showed no connection between meat and any sort of poor health outcome, and in particular cancer, because that's what they were looking at, in favor of these very weak, poorly designed, confounded studies that showed a very weak but not significant increase in association between meat consumption, even processed meat consumption, and cancer. And he said that, hey, you guys need to declare your biases. You need to show, because he said, you're all vegetarians and vegans and Seventh-day Adventists who are religiously opposed to eating meat. And so he said, you are all conflicted. You need to declare your biases on this paper. And they refused. And so people think that this is a legitimate, perusal of the available evidence. And it's not. It is complete and utter garbage. And, you talk about these hormetic effects. Okay, well, it's like exercise. No, it's not. It's like alcohol, where you're building up a tolerance towards something. Yes, there is an effect, and your body is building up different sorts of defenses and things like that, but it's defenses towards alcohol. So you're building up a tolerance towards alcohol. So does drinking alcohol and building up a tolerance towards alcohol help you in other physiological ways? The evidence would be no. And so that's the same sort of thing. So you can build up tolerances to these toxins, but that doesn't mean that that's going to translate to better health elsewhere. It's just going to protect you when you come across those toxins in those plants again. That's not hormesis, that's tolerance. Those are two different things. You talk about these antioxidants. They say, these have these antioxidant effects of these plants. And so these plant toxins, and we know that they're toxins. Why do we know that they're toxins? Because our bodies try to detoxify them and get them the hell out of your body. They don't use them for any physiological processes. The only physiological processes that are stimulated are ones that are trying to get them the hell out of your body. That is a toxin. That is obviously not something that your body wants there. So don't put it there, unless there's some sort of medicinal effect where the good outweighs the bad. And it doesn't always. People get put on medicine all the time that kills them. There are a lot of people that die from medical errors. It's estimated to be possibly the number 3 cause of death in America is medical error. Okay. So you can't just take, medicine is not always good. Medicine is a toxin that under certain circumstances, if used correctly, gives more benefit than harm, but it does cause harm. And when you're outside of that situation where it could cause benefit, you're only getting the harm. So you have these antioxidant effects of these different plant toxins. And why do we say that? Are they going around mopping up free radicals? No, but they stimulate glutathione and other sorts of processes in your body. And they say, well, glutathione is good. And all these other anti-inflammatory processes, those are all good. So this is good. This stimulates good things in your body. They're stimulating them to detoxify the poison you just ate. And it gets used to detoxify these things. And those toxins are causing harm at the same time. Interestingly, when Lane Norton tried to fell on his face trying to debunk something that I had said, he tried to say that, there's all these randomized control trials showing that all these plant chemicals are actually good for you. And he lists a couple of things, and he just hopes that no one checks them, or he assumes that none of his followers are going to check them and call him out on it, because when people do call him out on it, he just doesn't recognize it, he doesn't apologize, he doesn't retract anything, he just pretends it never happened. And so he said, when I put out these randomized control trials and all these things showing that plants are good, people run away. And so I looked up all the studies. Not a single one was a randomized control trial, not one. They were all epidemiological cohort studies. One was a systematic review of epidemiological cohort studies. And in that system, and in that review, there was literally one. I went through all of them because I was just tired of it. And there was one randomized control trial that looked at mastitis for nursing women, and they used ice packs or frozen cabbage leaves. And subjectively, the women said, yeah, I like the cabbage leaves better. They feel nicer because they sort of fit the shape of my breast. But objective inflammation reduction was exactly the same. But they just said, yeah, I kind of like the shape of the cabbage leaf better. That was his randomized controlled trial showing you that the ingestion of plant toxins is beneficial, right? So high level study from our friend Lane. But he had other things that actually proved my point. Because again, this is why you have to look at the study and not just the conclusion. It said, oh, people that ate more plants had lower heart attacks. Look at that. Look how great that is. Look at the study. It was in Costa Rica, had a few thousand people, and it was a retrospective cohort. So they asked people who had survived heart attacks. Now, they didn't ask people who died from heart attacks, right? So maybe people that were eating more vegetables died more from heart attacks, but they looked at the survivors and they said, okay, so they asked them a whole bunch of different things, right? How much did they smoke? How much did they drink? Their socioeconomic status, how many calories they sort of ate on average, how much sugar, junk food, and all these other sorts of things, exercise, all these sorts of things. They had asked a lot of different things. But the one thing they focused on was how many fruits and vegetables they ate. And they found in the highest quartile that of fruits and vegetable consumption, and they're looking at specifically like isothiocyanates. Jesus, I can't speak today, but they're trying to say like, okay, if they eat more of these plants, is that protective against having heart attacks? And they found, wow, look, all these people that ate more plants had lower heart attacks, right? And so if you just look at the abstract and things like that, there's some telltale things in there. They didn't just say that. But, if you don't look at the rest of it, you won't really see what's going on because sure, in the highest quartile of plant consumption, they did have less heart attacks, survived, but they also ate significantly less sugar, significantly less alcohol, exercised more, ate on average 800 less calories per day, and had less diabetes and less other sorts of issues, right? So massive confounding factors. But the interesting thing, probably the only useful thing that study did, was they looked at genetic discrepancies between people that that they had different sort of genetic idiosyncrasies that didn't allow them to eliminate these toxins as well, right? So they weren't able to detoxify the toxins. And that's how you know it's a toxin if your body's trying to detoxify it. It's not using it for anything, right? So the people that weren't able genetically to detoxify these things as well, they had, higher serum levels of these plant toxins for longer. And so they said, okay, does that make a difference, right? And in fact, no. The people that had that genetic issue, so they had higher levels of these plant toxins in their bloodstream for longer periods of time, actually had more heart attacks in that subset of the highest quartile. So it's not a perfect study, but it certainly does not show the evidence that these plant toxins are actually good for you and hormetic. It shows exactly the opposite, actually. Interestingly, with cancer, there was a study in mice, so how translatable that is to humans is hard to say, but they gave them naturally cured tobacco smoke and the flue-dried chemical formaldehyde-ridden sort of nastiness that we see today and for quite some time now. And the mice given the naturally dried tobacco, which is actually a product that humans have been using for hundreds and hundreds of years, European populations and Native American populations even longer, that they got all the emphysema and the plaques and the peripheral vascular disease and all these other sorts of things, but they didn't get the cancers. And these are cancer knockout mice, so they're very susceptible to cancers. You look at them funny, they get a tumor, and they weren't getting the cancers. The other ones were. So it may be that it's more a product of those weird ass chemicals that are then being added as an afterthought in the more more recent ways of curing tobacco than just the tobacco itself. And I'm not saying that people should smoke or that it's not dangerous. It is dangerous. It's horrible for you. It causes all those problems. But it's just to show you that we have an ever evolving understanding of the world around us, and we need to keep an open mind with that. And we need to be able to spot the bullshit. And this whole idea that plants have all these antioxidants and you need them, that is literally just a false flag. That is a complete farce, because it's your body's mounting an anti-inflammatory response against those toxins. So you're saying, yeah, it raises glutathione. Ooh, yay, glutathione. It's using the glutathione to get rid of this damn poison that you put in your body. And yes, it's getting rid of that poison, but is it mopping up other things at the same time? If your body needs more glutathione to deal with an issue, it will make more glutathione, evidenced by the fact that when you eat dirty, filthy plants, your glutathione goes up to try to detoxify these filthy things. So, you have to be able to sort of look at these things with a discerning eye and be able to spot the bullshit. And once you start seeing this enough, you start seeing patterns and you start saying, okay, you present it like this, but what about this? And you look into that and you find that it just undoes their whole argument. So one of the best, not in the nutrition world, but in just life in general, best person who does that is Thomas Sowell. That guy has dug deeper into everything to do with, economics and, and society than anybody. And so when people have these long, drawn out, complex arguments about this, that, and the other, he just knows it so well. He just cuts to the quick and just says, and in one or two sentences, he just completely dismantles their entire argument, and usually when you have this constructed argument, there is usually some little weak spot that everything will crumble down. Plants are really good for you. They lower heart attacks and things like that. And you look into it, it's like, well, no, actually they don't. There's all these confounding factors, and the toxins themselves are associated with more heart attacks. So that's really not proving your point. And, so you can find these weak points, but, the evidence is there. It's just a matter of knowing where to look.
I first came across what you're saying about the confounding factors when I was looking at a fiber study. And here's the thing about like reading the studies, the authors oftentimes put their own holes in their study, right? They're like, now what we found was the people that ate more fiber smoked less, exercised more, drank less. And, and the thing that really drives me is they're like, we statistically accounted for that. Like, okay, well, you can't statistically account for somebody's lifestyle, right? Like all you can do is then take your made up, and not made up, like I'm not going to diss all of science, but you're going to take this arbitrary risk factor from another study, and then you're going to try to statistically eliminate that risk factor based on their lifestyle and still come up with this idea that more fiber equals less cancer. And it's the fiber that's doing it. And I'm like, you can't do that. Like, and then you just go further. And like I said, like you said, people need to just look at it and realize that nutrition is imperfect. Like you're not going to have what I tell people is until we start cloning people and put identical twins in metabolic wards for 30 years and only feed them certain foods, you're not going to know. Right. And so I think it's exactly what you said. Just try it for yourself. Like you could smoke and drink alcohol every single day for the next year, and it's probably not going to kill you. So why are we so worried about eating red meat for 30 days? Like just do it. And if everything improves, if your skin conditions improve, your autoimmune conditions improve, your A1C improves, your glucose levels improve, your insulin improves, it may be a good indication. It might work well for you.
Yeah. And you can also, you look at these population studies, there's more and more evidence coming out. There's a study published from, I think it was the University of Adelaide in Australia. It was at 175 different countries and, tried to correcting for socioeconomic sort of differences and things like that. They found that the people that ate in all 175 countries, that the more meat people ate, the longer they lived and the better their health overall. Population studies, as you say, there can be a lot of problems with these sorts of things. But, the whole idea that eating a vegetarian diet and stewing meat is beneficial. I mean, it really doesn't even pass the smell test, because you have places like Hong Kong, they eat the most amount of meat per person per year. And, it's about, 1.5 pounds per person. And that's including women and children. They have the highest life expectancy of any sort of, developed country. We have native populations that are largely just eating meat, and they are self-reporting living well over 90 or 100. But that doesn't count because they don't have a government issued, birth certificate. Fine, you're not going to use that for your study, but this is something that people have been saying for hundreds of years, and it's been consistent. And actually, some anthropologists who studied this have actually shown that as long as you're not killed by something, and it's a hard life living out in the bush or in the jungle or in the savannah, that on the ice, that when they do live to adulthood and they die of old age, you're actually living just as long or than we are, but they don't get any of the chronic diseases that we get. They're so-called diseases of civilization. They get accidents, injuries, infectious diseases. Those are the things they contend with. And then when they move to cities or they start bringing in Western food, then they get the diseases. There's a contrast. And you can find this in any number of anthropological texts today, talking about this contrast where when they're living a pre-agricultural lifestyle, they don't get any of these non-communicable chronic diseases, the diabetes, heart disease, cancer, autoimmunity, etc. And then when they move to a more civilized post-agricultural way of living, then that shifts and they get the diseases of civilization, which are all these non-communicable chronic diseases. Okay, so that means that something in their environment changed, something in their environment when they were living more naturally, pre-agriculturally, they weren't getting anything, and then they switched, and now they're doing something that is causing those diseases, right? The same genetics. And then you just look at India. Everyone tries to say, well, if vegetarian's so bad and meat's so good, then explain India. Like, India explains this. This is a subcontinent that has like 1.4 billion people, eat 3 kilos of meat per person per year, and they have some of the highest metabolic disease rates on Earth. There was one study published in The Lancet, I believe in 2018, that showed that 25% of people in India, both in urban and rural populations, had type 2 diabetes. It's only 9% in America. Horrible, fat, sick, depressed America. And people are talking about, they're finally focusing on the health ramifications of all the food that we're eating. And they're saying America's the sickest place on earth. It's not actually. It's not. Most countries are this sick and some are far worse, like India. India is far worse because they eat far less meat. So these are traditional vegetarians, and they are some of the highest diabetes rates in the world, some of the highest metabolic disease rates in the world, some of the highest heart disease rates in the world. A statistic I came across where 1 in 4 people in India will die of a heart attack or heart disease. And 1 in 3 men will die from heart disease. They're all vegetarian. It's obviously not meat, right? So meat can't be the problem if they're only eating 3 kilos of meat per year and they're having a worse time than hunter-gatherer populations who eat way more than that and don't get any of those sorts of diseases. And I have a friend over there, it's Dr. Ankur Verma, who is an ER doctor, and he has a podcast as well. And he tells me all the horror stories and the things he sees. He said 15, 20 years ago, they weren't really, they were seeing very different patients in the emergency room. Now it's just all consequences of chronic disease. He said he had a 26-year-old lady, traditional Indian vegetarian diet, and she came in with a stroke at 26. And they said a young boy who's 17, and again, traditional Indian vegetarian, came with a heart attack. 17-year-old kid in school had a heart attack, right? So what the hell is that about? Oh, it's just genetic. Why is it happening again and again and again and again? And why is it that the first death from myocardial infarction in America in recorded history to ever be reported and published and proven on autopsy was in 1912, and there wasn't a single one before that? If this was just such a common thing, this is just genetic. If it was just genetic, well, first of all, if you're genetically having heart attacks as a teenager, you're probably not getting to reproduction age. So that would just take care of itself right there. But these things just weren't happening, and we were eating far more meat in the 1800s and before than we were in the early 1900s when heart disease became the number 1 killer in America. And so none of these things match up. And in fact, in the 1990s and 30s, when heart disease became the number 1 killer in America, we were eating the least amount of meat in America in 200 years. It's a U-shaped curve. In fact, if we took statistics before that, I would guarantee you it was higher going back as well, because at the beginning of the 1800s, it was at its apex, right? So that means in the late 1700s, it was at a similar level. And then it started coming down and down because they started pushing a vegetarian movement with the temperance movement, because they thought that meat made you lustful and want to have sex and things like that. And that was just the worst thing plaguing humanity at the time was people masturbating. And it was just like, if that's the worst problem that you have to contend with, you live a blessed life. You're in a beautiful time and era, and or you're just extremely misguided, because I mean, think of the 1800s, you had wars, you had the Civil War, you had slavery and oppression, and you're worried about people jacking off. Like, really, that's what keeps you up at night. Like, okay, maybe you need to get your priorities in check. But we were eating way more meat at that time, and then it started slowly coming down. And that's when you started seeing heart attacks come into play, because we started replacing meat with these processed food garbage items. Kellogg's cornflakes, sugar. This is when we invented seed oils, which are highly toxic. And people say, oh, no, they're so good. Okay, are they? What about randomized controlled trials in human populations going on for years, like the Minnesota coronary experiment, that replaced animal fats with polyunsaturated, heart-healthy, so-called vegetable oils and margarines? And in a blinded study, they didn't know they were getting margarine instead of butter. And it's well controlled because they were institutionalized. So they controlled every single meal that came in and out of there as much as you can. And what happened? It did lower cholesterol, and it did kill more people of heart attacks and strokes. And people say, well, all that shows is that linoleic acid's bad. Linoleic acid is a heavy component in all of these so-called heart-healthy plant oils, right? They didn't isolate linoleic acid. It's just these plant oils and margarines are high in linoleic acid. And so, no, it's actually the whole thing that caused the harm. Some people chose to focus on the linoleic acid. There is linoleic acid in there, the high degree. You're not getting that out. If you're eating so-called heart-healthy plant fats, you're getting a lot of linoleic acid. And but again, this is just looking at the whole seed oils, plant oils, and margarines. They didn't isolate linoleic acid and just give people that. They didn't do that. And the whole idea about plant oils and polyunsaturated fats being heart healthy. Oh, they're heart healthy. Where did that come from? That came from the American Heart Association, who just declared that based on no evidence. And now we know that they were paid the equivalent of $20 million by Procter & Gamble to say that. And it was a lie. It was completely made up. But that launched the American Heart Association to national prominence. It's a private organization. It was a few cardiologists got together and just said, hey, we should have a group. We should have an organization. Right? Because a lot of people, there seems to be a lot of people dying of heart disease now, and we should start doing something, right? And the simple fact that had to come up in the mid 1900s means that this was not a big deal before that. But they were paid. They were paid to say that. And so you have large scale randomized control trials with nearly 10,000 subjects, and it shows that replacing animal fat with plant oils actually kills you of heart attacks and strokes. So what are you basing the idea that plant oils are beneficial? Oh, I have this meta-analysis of what? Of epidemiology, of associational studies, which may or may not have been paid for by the industry that sells them in the first place, which will always support the product that they sell. So, but either way, whether or not they were paid for by some people that had bad motivations, how was the study done? Was it a large-scale randomized controlled trials in human that was reproducible? In this case, the deleterious effects is reproducible. There are at least 5 large-scale randomized controlled trials with thousands of human subjects that have replaced animal fats with plant oils and margarine and lowered cholesterol and found either no benefit or harm caused as a result of that. That's what the best evidence shows. And so as we started introducing these sorts of things, we started seeing these diseases go up. We know it's not meat. We're eating more meat in the 1800s. Yes, people were living long enough. We just discussed that. It's infant mortality rates that drops your average life expectancy. But 17-year-old kids are getting heart attacks in India. So why couldn't a 17-year-old in the 1800s have a heart attack if it was meat that was causing it? And the average life expectancy from birth in America in 1850 was 38 years old. People died in their 30s. Okay, well then why is it that in the 1700s they made it the law that you couldn't even apply to run for president of the United States unless you were 35, right? It's a 4-year term starting at 35, right? And you die at 38. Pretty dumb to have a 4-year term if you're going to be dead in 3 years on average, right? So again, that doesn't pass the smell test. John Adams was 92 when he died. He was, founder, second president of the United States. He was born in the mid 1700s, died in the mid 1800s. Jefferson was 84. All of the founding fathers born in the 1700s, unless they were killed by something, they died very late in life, 80s or 90s. And so that doesn't make sense. So average life expectancy from birth in 1850 was 38. But the people making the statistics then were a lot smarter than the people using the statistics now, because they looked at average life expectancy from age 0, from age 10, from age 20, from age 30 and 40 and 50 and 60 and 70 and 80. And so if there weren't anybody living to be 80 and to a significant degree, why keep statistics on it, right? If you made it to 10 years old, your life expectancy bumped up from 38 to 58. Just those 10 years, right? Because the majority of people were dying in infancy. And so that brings down the average. And if you look at people who just made it to adulthood, now you still have wars, you still have famines, you still have all these other sorts of things. So they're not all just dying of old age. But if you get to adulthood, and just early adulthood, your 20s, 30s, and 40s, statistically in 1850, people were living very similar lifespans than they are now. Okay, so people were definitely living long enough, and we were not seeing heart disease. We were not seeing these cancers. We were not seeing autoimmunity to this extent. We did see it. Virchow, who was a German physiologist and doctor, he described some of these scarring on the heart that was likely an old MI. Different sorts of plaques and damages to the arteries. And oh, this is really interesting. It was pathological. It was uncommon, right? It wasn't, oh yeah, this is normal. No, it was not normal. They recognized that this is not normal. You can look at anatomy drawings. Gray's Anatomy is hundreds of years old originally. Now, a lot of these designs and artistry go back hundreds of years. Da Vinci, Michelangelo, they did a lot of these for themselves because they wanted to know exactly how the body was put together so they could make more perfect and lifelike art. On the statue of the David, Michelangelo's David, his finger sort of goes like this. You might see that there's a muscle going like that, just right there. And that comes from the extension of just your pinky, the further extent of your pinky. So just that right there. I don't know if you guys can see it, but it's right there. Mm-hmm. So the David has the finger out like that, and that muscle is flexed on the statue. That's how perfect of an anatomist these people were. They knew how the body worked, and they would have seen this. In fact, they did see some sort of plaques and scarring very infrequently. So we could pick it up. We were seeing this. We were doing enough autopsies. People did a lot of autopsies back then because that was sort of the mainstay of medicine, was just doing dissections all the time, because that was your roadmap. That's what you were working on, was the human body. And we were not seeing these things. We were not seeing people dying of massive heart attacks and strokes and things like that. That all came after we ate less meat, more plants, more processed plants, because processed foods are processed plant foods. So it's processed seed oils, it's processed sugars, it's processed grains and carbs and all these other sorts of things as well. And I'm sorry, but I don't need any study to tell me that those things are deleterious to our health, in relation, as compared to eating a more meat-based diet, because we can see it. We can see it with our own eyes. When we're eating less meat, more plants, more processed food, these diseases become more prevalent. Then we started increasing the amount of meat that we were eating. These diseases started coming up as well. And people say, oh, look at that. There's a correlation between meat and these diseases. Look back 10 years. There's no correlation. Look back 100 years. There's even less correlation. Look back 200 years. There's no correlation, right? It's completely separate. You look at, just this one little period between 3:30 and 5:30 afternoon, JT was a dick. And so therefore he is a dick, and it's like, no, you look at the entirety of the life cycle of the issue, and you just see, okay, this is a very different picture, right? And so, that's the other thing too. It's just like there's so much there that it really shows that there is absolutely no correlation whatsoever between eating meat and any sort of disease. There's at least correlation between processed foods and plants and these diseases. And in fact, doing a sort of a real world experiment, people just remove these plants and certainly the processed foods, but also plants. People are eating a clean diet with meat and plants, or mostly plants, and they're getting all these diseases, and you take them away and it goes away. So that is really the only evidence I need, is when I, as a doctor, I sit my patient down and we go through their issues, we change their lifestyle, and all of a sudden their weight's dropping off, their health is improving, their biomarkers are improving, their life is improving from a subjective point of view, and they're coming off medications. I don't need any other evidence than that. Going back to Hippocrates, it's part of the Hippocratic Oath is that you don't just do things because they were always done. And you don't just pray to Apollo hoping to get a result. You need to do what works. And when you do something, you see that it works, you do that. When you do something, you see it doesn't work as well as something else, you don't do that and you do this other thing. So I'm seeing this. I was taught certain things. This is how you treat X, Y, and Z. Fine. Okay. Well, we tried that and I'm finding much better results doing something else. And so when I do that and I get better results and it's consistent, I never get an outlier in my practice, then it behooves me to keep going with that and recommend it to other people. It would be unethical if I did anything else. If I just said, no, but plants are so great and pushed an ideology on people, that would be honestly malpractice. And so, I don't do that. I look at what works, and what works is the best or ketogenic carnivore diets. There can be gray area, there can be, gradients. And I use them, when people aren't able to go full, whole hog on it. But when I see people do that, they get better. And so how could I ethically, morally do anything else? Or you're hurting the animals. I'm hurting my patients if I don't, right? You're killing animals, you're killing people if you do anything else, and they're suffering. And, somebody said, well, but does curing your diseases, does that give you the right, to take an animal's life? And yes, it does. 100%.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And especially because, what is it compared to? Compared to what? Compared to eating plants that are grown in a monocrop, situation where you're having to kill hundreds of thousands of animals a year to protect your crop. And you're poisoning them. You're poisoning the groundwater and the rain. Rainwater now has glyphosate in it in many areas. It's in the groundwater. It's in the rainwater. It's destroying the environment and the ecosystem and killing, multitudes of animals. So the alternative is no better from an animal ethics point of view. But yes, it is 100% justifiable to eat animals if your life depends on it. 100%, 100%. And so I use that, and that's the moral compass I keep.
I completely agree. And I'll leave with a couple quick things for people to go look up. I came across a couple interesting statistics. If you take a look at some of these countries that eat really high carbohydrate, a lot of times the United States, we look at obesity as the fact that we're sick. Yes, we do have a health problem. But if you take out obesity and you go look at countries like Japan, China, India, all countries that people consider healthy because they have lower, maybe not so much India, they have lower obesity rates. All three of those have higher diabetic rates than the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Ansel Keys is the one that got all this started with, plant fats versus the animal fats. And that's because he selectively picked 7 out of 25 countries that fit his bias. Shocker. And my favorite randomized control trial I have ever seen from the infamous Dr. Lane Norton, that margarine is better for you than butter because it was a study done with muffins.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
My goodness.
Yeah. Forget the Minnesota coronary experiment with 10,000 human subjects where they specifically replaced butter with margarine and more people died of heart attacks and strokes. Don't worry about that one. Go for the muffins.
Muffins.
Yeah,
so the rest of this, I could probably do, I might have to do that UK carnivore guys thing and do just a 24-hour carnivore show. So in closing, what are 1 or 2 things to help people get over the hump and just try carnivore for 30 days? I know you run a lot of 30-day challenges.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is that it's a lot easier when you strike when the iron's hot. When you have that initial motivation, like, okay, I should do this, you really, really drive into that. If you're living on your own or you're with people that are happy to do it with you, clear out the fridge, get that crap out of there. If you're trying to quit smoking, having a bunch of packs of cigarettes around the house is not a good idea because you're going to be tempted. And when you have a moment of weakness, it's right there. Whereas if it's not there, if it's outside of the house and you would actually have to go out and do something. You're like, well, I really want that, but screw it, I'll just cook a steak. It's a lot easier to stay on track. And those first couple of weeks can be, the most difficult as far as cravings are concerned. And try to surround yourself by people that have a positive view about what you're trying to do. You can join Facebook groups. You could join coaching groups. You don't need to. You join Facebook groups like Zeroing In on Health, Zero Carb Health. They've been around for decades, and they have these people that have been doing this for decades. And, they're very strict. And so they don't, there's some of them, they're just, oh yeah, sort of laissez-faire, do whatever you want sort of thing. These guys don't. They're like, no, look, this is the right way to do it. And you can do whatever you want, but when you're here, this is how we want you to behave. It really helps people early on because they get very confused with all the different sorts of information. So try to go into a place with people that understand where you're coming from. Try to watch videos, try to engage in different conversations about these things and educate yourself. The most important thing about doing this is why you're doing it. If you have a good reason why, then it's a lot easier to figure out the how. There are videos on how. I have tons of videos. I'm sure you have tons of videos on how to do this and also why to do this. So immerse yourself in those things. Try to figure out what the facts and evidence are behind this. And then, I have a one on carnivore for beginners and things like that. I'm sure you have similar things. A lot of people have these things. Find them, look at them, and then try to jump in, head first. You can do it on a slow sort of march, but you have to have clear dates where you're making changes. On this date, we're cutting out all processed food. Next Friday, we're cutting out, carbs and grains and sugars and things like that. The next Friday, we're cutting out nightshades. The next Friday, we're just cutting out this. And the next Friday, we're cutting out everything and we're full on. You need to have it marked on your calendar on these days. These things go away and you're eating more meat every single day and focusing on the fat. And then on a certain day, that's it. You're just all meat for the next 30 days and really commit to that. You can always go back. It's not the end of the world. If you don't like it, don't do it. Sometimes that's helpful. I've had patients that I've thought that a carnivore diet was the best thing for them. They had diabetes, they had autoimmune issues, they had all these other sorts of things. And I was like, this is what's going to be the best for you. And then they were like, okay, this sounds really weird, but they did it for 30 days and they said, look, this is really restrictive for me. Can we open this up in any way? And I said, yeah, we can, but look, you're diabetic. You really need to be on a ketogenic approach. So still eat a lot of meat. You can add in these sorts of things, but stay ketogenic. Yeah, I can do that. No problem. Okay. They come back 3 weeks later and they say, okay, hey, how you doing? And they're like, yeah, I think I need to go back to carnivore. I just felt so much better during that month. I didn't even realize it until I started adding things back in. And that's really important. When you have that contrast, when you have at least those 30 days, even better yet, 100 days, 3 months, you have a basis of comparison. And then sometimes people feel so much better and they recognize that. Sometimes they feel better and don't realize how significantly better they feel. And then they start eating back another way, start adding things back in, and it really hits them in the face just how harsh these toxins are on their body. And then they go like, right, okay, I don't want to do that anymore. So that's pretty much it. Just educate yourself and jump feet first and get rid of stuff in the fridge, get rid of stuff in the pantry. If you keep a carton of cigarettes of it around when you quit smoking, you're planning on failure. And well, I paid money for this and, I don't want to waste it. If it's poison and you don't want to eat it, like there's not a waste, just get it out of your house. But I paid a lot for that toxic sludge and I want to, and get it out of your house, get it out of your environment. If you can. I mean, some people live with others and you just do the best you can, but if you can, that's a really good way to do it. I did want to just say one thing about this, friend Ansel Keys. He was actually one of the lead researchers on that Minnesota coronary experiment. And surprise, surprise, they buried it. They wouldn't publish it, right? That was done between 1968 and 1973. And they buried it. Ansel Keys was known to be on the payroll of the sugar companies, didn't really advertise that fact, and said that, maybe cholesterol causes heart disease, maybe it doesn't, but it's easy enough to just cut it out. It's not like you need it. It's not like your entire body and brain are made out of it and all your hormones are made out of it, so just don't worry about it. But you need those calories. And so you should replace those fat calories with sugar because sugar is just a clean calorie source. And, but he was being paid to say that. He was on the payroll of the sugar companies, right? And so they buried the Minnesota coronary experiment, which is why no one gets taught this in medical schools. And we have the whole cholesterol heart hypothesis. It was uncovered 40 years later by Dr. Ramsden at the NIH, who sort of found whispers that this thing had been done and contacted the children of one of the other lead researchers. And it turned out that they had their dad's old resources and notes on the study in their basement. And so they were able to uncover this and publish it, I believe in 2020 or 2014. And then the really interesting thing is, there we go. So I don't know if we're still recording. I think we lost JT, but I'll just finish the thought anyway, that Ansel Keys, when he did the Seven Nations study, where he looked at this exponential growth in correlation, again, only correlation. There we go. You there, buddy? Let me see. I'm sure all this can be edited out and cleaned up. I'll give him a second. Nope. Okay. So when they showed this hockey stick sort of exponential growth in association between cholesterol and heart disease, in these 7 nations, you look at 22 nations, there's no correlation whatsoever. But just looking at those 7 nations, in fact, in his own data, he found that the exact same increased risk association, the R value for sugar and heart disease, was exactly the same as cholesterol. So the R value for cholesterol and sugar were exactly the same. And yet his takeaway from that, what he promoted, was stop eating fat and cholesterol, eat sugar instead. So that tells me that this was done in a very dishonest manner and that he's a dishonest person. And so other people are kinder than I and think, well, he was just ideologically driven and you just couldn't understand how it wasn't cholesterol. But I mean, he had that right in front of him, that cholesterol and sugar had the exact same R value. And yet he recommended not eating cholesterol and eating sugar instead. So that's I think pretty clear to me what was going on there. All right. So I don't know if JT's going to be able to come back, but thank you very much, JT. I really appreciate it. It was great to talk to you. Been chatting online and things like that for a while now, but it's great to actually sit down and talk with you. And hopefully you guys like it. Take care. There we go.